Today's guest, Dr. Ivan Pupulidy, retired as the director of the U.S. Forest Service Human Performance Innovation and Organizational Learning Program, where he guided research and development in ways to make high-risk operations safer. His research focused on understanding how people work in complex adaptive systems, which led to the development of a process called the Learning Review, which replaced the serious accident investigation process in the Forest Service. The team led by Dr. Pupulidy is credited with facilitating the improvement of risk management skills and fostering a culture of learning in the United States Forest Service. Ivan's ability to integrate academic research with real-world application comes from his varied life pursuits, which have included work as a mine geologist, exploration geophysicist, and a U.S. Coast Guard pilot for rescue and law enforcement missions. Ivan also served in the United States Air Guard and Air Force Reserves, where he flew the C-130 Hercules. While on active military service, he flew combat and humanitarian support missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Central Africa, and as well as piloting the modular airborne firefighting system on wildland fires. Before becoming the director in the Forest Service, Ivan was an accomplished Forest Service aviation firefighter. Most recently, Ivan became a professor with the University of Alabama, Birmingham, where he is able to continue his research and passion for creating safer workplaces. Join our Director of Operations, Glenn Daniels, and Dr. Ivan Pupulidy.
This is a Touchstone Publishers presentation, your trusted source of leadership knowledge.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Essential Leadership, the Skills, the podcast. And let's fix this issue right now with the echo. Give us just a second, we'll kill it. Well, maybe it's not there anymore. Okay, fine. So, good morning. I guess the echo's gone. It happened that fast. I didn't touch anything. So, our introductory lady did not say the last name correctly, but let me tell you before I even have him corrected for you. Sit down, pull out a paper, pencil, or your tablet, or whatever it is. Prepare to take notes, because this session today is about saving lives. That's all I can tell you. Okay, that's all, and we're going to get into it. But Dr. Ivan, correct us on the pronunciation of your last name.
Pupulidy.
So she was close, Pupulidy, but not quite there. Okay, all righty. So you guys heard his background, firefighting, Air Force, flying this. She called it the C-130. It's the C-130, I believe, but it's just the ideal that your research in this firefighting area is saving lives. It has saved lives. You actually have changed, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about how did you come up with that passion for that, because you have changed the way the forest fires are fought.
Yeah, to some degree, I think that's certainly true. So the way I came to it, I like to say I came to safety naturally or honestly. And this is through fundamentally the being an operator and being on the front line and going through 10 years of active duty Coast Guard service, flying the C-130 and Falcon jet for the Forest Service, and having 2 friends die in aviation accidents in that 10-year period of time. It kind of piqued my interest and made me want to get into something related to safety, but it wasn't enough at that point to be a passion. 2 people dying in 10 years wasn't enough. But I moved into the Forest Service, and when I moved into the Forest Service in my first year, I'd lost 3 friends in aviation accidents.
Oh, wow.
And by the time I'd been in the Forest Service for 10 years, I'd lost over 25 friends in aviation accidents alone. It made me really look at things very differently. It made me become passionate about safety and about doing things in a different way. Specifically, the thing that I was most interested in doing differently was the serious accident investigation process. So I became an accident investigator as part of one of my collateral duties in the Forest Service. And what I recognized pretty quickly was that the process that we had wasn't conducive to learning from the event. Very frequently what we would do is do a serious accident investigation. We'd go there and we'd find somebody guilty of some violation, or we'd find human error as a cause. And I kept wondering to myself, well, wait a minute, I make mistakes all the time and it doesn't end up in fatalities. My friends make mistakes all the time and it doesn't end up in fatalities. How can there be a cause and effect relationship between human error and a fatality? How can that exist? And so we started looking at things a little bit differently. And one of the things that we did was we developed a thing that we call the learning review, which basically looks at the context around decisions and actions. Rather than judging them as bad or good, we simply look at the context and we ask ourselves, hey, what were the things in the system that allowed it to make sense for the individual to do what they did?
So we're kind of saying it's a system that we need to take a look at. Because also, we've talked about this, and I want to bring it up to everybody. Accident prevention is a function of the capacity to learn. So You're saying that when you're reviewing things, you're starting to look for what to learn. And are you saying the system is what really needs to be reviewed?
Absolutely. Every aspect of the system needs some sort of review. Now, there's an economy of scale, right? If we look at an incident and the incident has a tremendous amount of learning potential, we should invest in that. If, on the other hand, the incident doesn't have a tremendous amount of learning potential, we shouldn't invest in it. We shouldn't invest in as much in it. However, let's take a look at the way we've done things in the past. In the past, if there's been a significant loss, then we felt like we had to put more money and more effort into it. But that's kind of the cart dragging the horse along, right? What we really want to think about is, what is the learning potential from this event? And so when we think about learning potential, we don't think about learning what to do and what not to do. We think about how we can create learning products for leadership, for the field, and for middle leaders within the program, because we recognize everybody within the system is a learner, and we have to respect learners. This is another big thing that we don't normally do in accident investigations. Normally we spoon feed them the answer. Well, what if we didn't do that? What if we presented them with a narrative, and we presented them with context, and we presented them with some tough questions that they have to wrestle with? What if we did that?
Well, it kind of makes me wonder, though, if you did that, wouldn't you be pointing to another one of your thoughts, though, is that, at least right now, over the past, has been, like you said earlier, pilot error, human error. You kind of stand on the grounds that mistakes are normal.
That's right.
People are fallible, and it's going to happen. But if we're giving this review board and saying, okay, here's the process, teach us, aren't they more than likely to go back and kind of say, well, human error?
Human error becomes then a starting point. So think about it this way. Human error gets us to the place where we start to look at what's going on inside the system. But we kind of want to look at it like a stage. And we want to see how the stage is set. How is the stage set in such a way that the person's actions made sense to them at the time? Because if they didn't make sense, they wouldn't have done it, right?
Right.
I mean, it's pretty simple, and yet we've never really looked at accidents that way in the past. We simply say human error, and then we move on. Well, human error becomes a starting point in that now the stage is what we're most interested in. How is that stage set? How is it orchestrated in a way that the system influences make the individual do things in a certain way? And now we're not looking really at cause here. We're looking more at influence. So if we think about influence opens up the spectrum of our ability to talk about something in a very profound way. I'll give a really poignant current example, right?
Okay.
We're sitting here looking at this January 6th thing that happened at the Capitol building, and we're pointing our finger at Giuliani, Trump Jr., and Trump and saying that they caused it. And now we're in a position where we have to prove that causality. What if we dropped back for a second and thought about it as a learning opportunity and said they influenced the crowd to move up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol building, and that was a function of influence rather than a function of cause? All of a sudden, all kinds of aspects of this open up for us. We can talk about a lot more of the event and a lot more richness, and we don't aggravate the situation. We enjoin everybody in learning from this, which is what we really need to do. Now move this to an accident scenario and think about a person having an accident. They didn't intend to do anything wrong. They didn't intend to make a mistake. They certainly didn't intend to die or get hurt. So if we start from the premise that they were well-intended people that morning when we entrusted them with the work, and they remained well-intended people throughout the day, then why in the world would we want to blame them for their own death? Why would we want to do that?
Well, okay, so when I was in my preparation for this, and now that you made me start thinking about the January 6th incident, I want to go all the way back to 19, I think it was 69. Pretty sure it was. It was an aircraft crash that happened in Portland, Oregon. And these pilots on the way, so this was during the time period they would have the flight engineer and the co-pilot and the pilot, had three, but they had to declare an emergency, so they had to keep on flying around till they figured out what they were going to do. And they made like 3 or 4 longer trips. When they finally got set up for their final approach, the plane ran out of fuel.
Mm-hmm.
So that was immediately determined pilot error because the flight engineer was saying, no, had told the pilot, they got it on voice recorder, they told the pilot like 4 times, hey, you got to get down, we're out of fuel. But you're saying that, well, we all know the pilot, he did everything in his power to make sure he got to the airport. That's why he flew around so much. But there was something wrong with the system. I'm gathering from what you're saying, what I'm starting to learn, something wrong with the system that caused them to do that. Even though the engineer is sitting back here saying, hey, we're running low, we're running low.
So let's think about the dynamic inside the aircraft.
Okay.
This is the stage again, looking at that stage.
Yes.
This is a United flight. It's a United flight, and the systems are pretty well known to the flight engineer, and the flight engineer, his job is to monitor fuel and give the pilot updates on the fuel consumption and fuel
That's
burn.
what I was talking about, by the way.
Yeah,
I guess I said 69. It could have been American, but it was United. Yeah, okay. Good call. Perfect.
And you're absolutely right in everything that you said. The pilot literally flew the airplane until the airplane ran out of fuel, and obviously without fuel, it doesn't have power and it can't make it. It has to glide to wherever it glides to, right? So when we start thinking about what happened, the dynamics on board the airplane are what the most important aspect of this particular incident are.
The stage.
Yeah,
Of it.
the stage. And the stage is set in such a way that there's a power differential, a power dynamic. And the power dynamic is such that the captain of the aircraft has the ultimate authority, responsibility, and the very last word on everything. Right. So however the captain prioritizes the situation, this is the way the stage is set, that is the way the play will unfold. And so when the co-pilot and the flight engineer say to the pilot, hey, we need to get this plane on the ground because we're running out of gas, the pilot's priority is, wait a minute, we've got another malfunction, a gear malfunction indication on the aircraft, and I don't want to land this airplane because it's very embarrassing with no landing gear.
Right.
So the pilot's priority is warped because of a bunch of other things that had happened within the system. There had been notifications about gear up landings. There had been notifications about the punitive actions that would be taken against pilots for gear up landings. And the system was set up in such a way that there was a lot of pressure on the pilot not to make that mistake. So when the pilot's going through this, the pilot's prioritizing based on all of these internal and external pressures what the most important things are for him. Now, he is getting feedback from the crew, and the feedback from the crew counters what he's doing. In other words, he wants to fly and troubleshoot the landing gear problem and make sure all the landing gear are down and locked. But what they want to do is say, let's get this thing on the ground. I think it's an indicator problem. Let's land. But the dynamic, the power dynamic was such that that kind of information wasn't shareable. And now we get into this leadership space. What's the role of a leader in this kind of a place, right?
Perfect.
And the role of a leader is really to create a workplace wherein workers can be successful. But United hasn't built that capacity into the system yet. This incident triggers them to do something very, very different. And the thing that they do is they create a program called Crew Resource Management. And crew resource management is fundamentally a system of communication wherein lower rated people on the flight deck can provide information to the captain, and the captain should listen. And they do this through dialogue. They do this through scenario-based training. They do this through simulator training. And what their overall objective is to show the captain that this hierarchical approach, this I'm going to hold you accountable, I'm looking down at you, I'm the captain, I'm the boss, that disrupts communication. And that's really not leadership, that's really management.
Right.
So crew resource management starts to introduce the philosophy of leadership in the cockpit at the time. So here it is 1969, and we're starting to do that. We actually had a whole bunch more accidents that were just like this
Yes.
where captains were authoritative and shut down the other crew members to the point where there were crashes. And we didn't do anything about it. We didn't do anything until this accident. This accident precipitated really fundamentally leadership-based training at United Airlines.
So for those of you who like to draw lines of certain things, this new procedure, the new module that United put in is really a servant leadership procedure, servant leadership model.
Yeah.
Everybody who's responsible for getting information and sharing that information is up to the leaders to get that. So let's move that 69 to 2012 or whatever year in 2021.
After COVID, it's all a blur.
It's all a big blur. It for sure is. When you go now to look at accidents and things that are happening, how do you get organizations, and I'm sure the forest department is better at it because of your work there, but how would you suggest to an organization, okay, let's take apart this accidental death that happened on your watch? Somebody the other day was crushed by a crane. Okay, that wasn't put in park. Mm-hmm. So first thing, obviously, is they're going to blame the driver of the crane that didn't have it in park. But you're saying there's more to it, and if just being able to outline it, because you're not there, you can't go through all the details, but begin to outline it. Is the first thing you're saying they need to do is look at the stage?
Yeah.
Was it like after a 12-hour workday that this person?
Exactly. So that's part of the stage, right? What is the fatigue level of the individual? Now, we don't want to quantify that, right? We all know how we act individually when we're tired.
Right.
We don't really have a number for that. I don't have like a number 5 for fatigue today. I have no idea where I am numerically, but I have a sense of where I am cognitively, right? That's important, but that's not the relevant piece. The relevant piece is that it's an influence in the system. So fatigue could be an influence.
Okay.
The crew duty day is a consideration to help us start to map the stage or see the stage in terms of fatigue. One thing. The other thing is distractions. What other kinds of distractions are in the system? Are there goal conflicts that exist? That the leadership is saying safety first, but what company produces safety? I haven't met that company yet, right? All companies produce something other than safety.
Yeah.
So if we say safety is our number one priority, but get the job done today, are we really saying that safety is our number one priority? Or are we giving the worker this goal or this job of balancing these goal conflicts? So these are the kinds of things that we mean about the stage. And when we look at the stage, we start to understand one fundamental thing. We could go in and we could blame the individual for making a mistake. And we could do something punitive. But here's the effects of punitive action. One effect is that nobody's going to talk to us anymore.
Right.
It's just not going to happen. And what we realize in safety is that the currency of safety is information. So if people aren't talking to us, we've just cut off our major source of currency. Well, that's not the right thing to do. So why would we do that? Why in the world would we do that? And again, going back to that individual, they were a trusted individual that morning. They have an accident. Now, all of a sudden, we don't trust them. We hold them as suspect and sometimes even criminally hold them as suspect. It's crazy.
Right.
We had a young firefighter, 30-mile fire was the name of the fire. 4 young firefighters, first-year firefighters died at this event. Mm-hmm. And L. Reese Daniels was the IC, incident commander, for this event.
Okay.
And the accident investigation was done in the old style, and it was done in such a way that agentive language was used against L. Reese Daniels, saying that he essentially caused the death of these 4 individuals. And they said because he wasn't assertive enough, he wasn't direct enough, he wasn't a leader in this situation. Well, the reality of the situation was he's negotiating space with 2 groups of people that he hasn't dealt with before. It's a kind of a pickup ball game, if you will.
So there's another piece of influence then.
Right. And he has the authority, the position power, but he doesn't necessarily have the personal power with these individuals. And so they determined that the safest place for them to shelter in this advancing firestorm that's coming at them is in a rock scree away from the road, away from the fire as far as they can get. So they climb up into the rock scree. L. Reese says, no, stay down here on the road with me. Stay down here on the road with me. Well, where he was on the road, actually nobody was hurt. But with the 6 people that went up into the rocks, 4 of them are killed and 2 of them are badly injured. Now, is this El Reis's fault? Or is there something else we could do, much like the United situation, that we can start to look at the crew dynamic and the way the stage is set for El Reis and say, are the decisions that he made wrong? No. Let's not do that, because they're only wrong in hindsight. Instead, we could actually say that his decision to stay on the road was right and their decision to go up into the rock scree was wrong. But he told them to come down and they didn't do it. So now we've got this question of autonomy. How much autonomy do you want to give somebody in this situation? And so this is a leadership dynamic that we could really fervently discuss and learn from, as long as we don't simply blame El Reis. But what we do is we blame El Reis.
Well, number one, I wonder why, because he's the one. But I think, well, you have to wonder why, because he's the one that instructed them to stay down, and they didn't listen to his instruction. But that's part of the influence. The influence to me kind of says, okay, he didn't have, like you said, that personal relationship, that personal power to have these people follow his decision. So maybe the stage needs to change as far as a leader's training there. To say, okay, here's how, I mean, you can't just ask somebody like that in a life and death situation. You got to say, whatever it is. I mean, you got to figure that out. Also, the other part of the stage sounds like that there's too many chiefs in the plan. I mean, here's 6 people who decided just to flat out ignore it. And how many people survived? I mean,
this is a really tenuous situation, because
yes,
what it requires is somebody to have a perfect crystal ball in a complex environment.
Right.
And so if El Reis did have that perfect crystal ball, he could say, staying down here with me is the safest place. But he doesn't know that. And what they all don't know is that there's a dynamic in this one canyon that resulted in a plume of hot air coming straight across the canyon. And as it happens, almost as though it was targeting these 6 people on the side of the hill. It literally went right over the top of El Reis. There's no way that he could have predicted that. So this idea of complex systems delivering the unexpected means that we have to have a certain degree of autonomy in the space. In other words, I don't want to be the guy that says you need to stay right here, because I could be wrong about that. My crystal ball might not be working.
Yeah, exactly, right? Exactly.
And it's just as likely that plume of hot air could have hit El Reis, but it didn't. So
this is a bit of a concern then, because, and you actually talk about this, understanding and mapping a systematic of the condition. Understanding and mapping the condition. If you don't have all the information, what does that mean?
Well, that means that we have to act with an understanding that we don't have all of the information.
Okay.
Right? And so this means 2 things for a leader. One thing that it means for a leader is that we have to have some ability to converse with the members of our team openly. Amy Edmondson refers to this as psychological safety, that the worker themselves or the person within the system has the feeling that they can speak truth to power. We like to change that around a little bit. We like to talk about it, instead of psychological safety, we like to talk about it in terms of psychological confidence, for 2 reasons. One, from a worker perspective, if I'm confident enough to speak truth to power in my organization and say, I'm not comfortable with this, and I'm given the language to do it, then that's a really important thing for the worker. But the other part of it is that leaders can actually build that. You can actually specifically build psychological confidence. And you do that by entering into things with humble inquiry, being in that humble space, and having the humility to say, I don't know all the answers. I need your input. Now, you would think that in time-compressed situations like aviation, we wouldn't have time to do that. It's not true. It's categorically untrue. In fact, the leadership technique that we used while we were flying in combat in Iraq, that I've carried through for the rest of my career, is this little briefing. Guys, I don't care what's happening on the flight deck. I want you to tell me if you see something that's dumb, dangerous, or different. Break into our conversation. Let us know if you see something that's dumb, dangerous, or different. And what that does is it empowers the crew in a specific way. And that's what I mean about building that psychological confidence. Now the crew members feel like they can speak truth to power.
So the psychological confidence, that's really, I mean, we talk about confidence, but psychological confidence means that you are strong enough to allow the other people's confidence to step up.
That's exactly right.
And you do that by asking questions.
And you have to kind of be humble in that space as a leader. So without the humility, I like to say that anybody who flies the C-130 airplane, anybody who flies it, gets an egoectomy when they get their aircraft commander designation, because you can't have a big ego and fly that airplane. If you do, you're going to alienate your crew and bad things are going to happen. Right. And so we recognize that through crew resource management training, but also we recognize that because we have a relationship that we build with our crews. And that relationship is very important. And it's both hierarchical and non-hierarchical. Now, what I mean by that is aircraft commanders will have the ultimate decision. So there is a hierarchy. However, they're going to join the crew in helping to make that decision. And that's done in this way of building psychological confidence. And by giving them certain little cues like, sir, I'm not comfortable with this. If you hear that, that's a big indication. The other thing is sometimes if you hear silence,
it's an indication.
Another big indication. So it's being sensitive. It's allowing yourself to recognize the strength of vulnerability, because you are vulnerable in this position. But it's also understanding that as a leader, you don't need to be large and in charge. That's not what you need to be. What you need to be is in that mode of really gathering the best information possible, because you're working in a complex environment. Not everything is predictable. And there's this guy, Horace Brittle, came up with this idea called wicked problems. And what we find is, and we're seeing it more and more in society now, that we're facing these wicked problems. And wicked problems aren't problems that have simple solutions. But what they have is an opportunity to find potential solutions through sense-making, learning, and improvisation. And this is where I go to this great guy, Reuben McDaniel, who was a professor emeritus at University of Texas, Austin. Brilliant guy. And Reuben came up with this idea of sense-making, learning, and improvisation. And he told it to me one day, and I sat there and I thought, my God, that is exactly what we do in aviation. When we're flying the airplane and we hit an anomaly, we recognize that the system's not delivering the expected. The immediate thing that we do is move into sense-making. We learn in the moment, and we innovate solutions. And those innovations aren't necessarily fixes, right? Go ahead.
The reason why that caught my attention when getting ready for this is that word improvisation. It kind of, I mean, to be honest, it kind of said, well, wait a minute, especially in an airplane. I mean, you got checklist after checklist, and if you improvise any checklist, you're headed for trouble. If you improvise any change of procedure, you're in trouble. But now I kind of catch it. You're saying, and correct me, coach me, you're saying that if something goes off schedule, something goes wrong, that's when sense-making and learning and improvisation comes into effect.
Exactly.
And you can learn a lot by opening the door for other people to speak up.
Yeah. And we call that opening the door piece, we call that cognitive diversity, bringing in a diverse group of people to help solve these wicked problems. That's the key. And you hit it. I mean, you hit it like dead on, right? Let's look at an example. Let's look at Sully Sullenberger,
okay,
right? Landing on the Hudson. So he hits geese at about 18,000 feet, and the engines are both damaged by the impact. And he's got a lot of vibration going on inside the airplane. He's got a lot of sudden different alarms going off and signals being sent to him. He and his crew member on the flight deck now enter into sense making. They make sense of this flood of information. It is no longer what they expect. Now, they both determine that what's necessary in order for them to gain some control of the aircraft is to shut down both engines. So they shut down both engines. The vibration stops. The ram air turbine drops out of the bottom of the airplane, providing electrical power for the airplane, but only electrical power for the systems. And remember, this is a computer-driven airplane. So the computer drives all the control surfaces with the exception of the rudder. That's the only one the pilot has direct control over. So they need the computer in order to control this thing at all.
Right.
So they're making sense of what they have, and that takes time. And in the time that it takes for them to make sense, they've lost some options. One option that they've lost is turning the airplane around and going back to LaGuardia.
Or a head of
Now,
Teterboro or anything, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you see the options kind of winnowing away. I mean, they literally, if you listen to the entire transcript, you see every option with every foot of altitude lost, every option winnows away. But you could go back in and you could say, well, he made a mistake because, look, we took 18 exemplar pilots, we brought them to Tarbes, France, where the best simulator is. We gave them an engine out situation at exactly the same place as Sully, and they were all able to turn the simulator around and land back at LaGuardia. To which we'd go, timeout, Green Bay foul shot.
Yeah, really. I mean, that's what. Well, wait a minute. They're expecting it for one, right? So the sense
Exactly.
part is drawn down because they're expecting it. It's already in the mix.
And that time of sense making isn't necessary because they're expecting it. The anticipation cuts that time out. So by the time they've made sense of it on board the actual airplane, they've lost altitude and they've lost the option.
Right.
And so we have to think about it this way. They bring out the checklist and they find that the checklist is designed for engine loss over the water at 36,000 feet or more. Well, the one thing that you don't have at 18,000 feet is the altitude that you do at 36,000 feet.
Which gives you more time, which then
exactly.
is still restricting your options.
Exactly. So when they start to run the checklist, they recognize the checklist is no longer applicable for the situation that they're in. And so now they've got to improvise. So what they do is they make sense of what they have, they learn in the moment, and they improvise a solution. And the improvised solution is to land on the Hudson. Now, the interesting thing about that, and I think the thing that makes this heroic, is that when they commit to that improvisation, they commit to limiting the loss of life to just the people on board the airplane. Now, I say that very poignantly because we had never really been successful at landing a wide-body jet on the water before this. All too often, something drags. An engine hits first, a wing hits first, an airplane cartwheels, people break their necks, die in the accident. And had that happened, he would have been vilified. But that didn't happen. The outcome changed the way we described him. And now we describe Sully as a hero because the outcome was positive. But here's the thing. He never knew what the outcome was. So as a leader, he was doing the best he could with what he had. And that's something we've really got to appreciate.
And when it comes to this ideal of taking what he did and what others have done and decide, okay, here's what's going on. I have a sense for what's going on now. And then the learning, maybe it's asking more questions, maybe it's remembering something, but the learning, that applies. And I mean, not just safety in a company, but also applies to being more productive.
Absolutely.
And if we can do that, we can get a long ways. And I think, though, part of the problem is we don't have this in a lot of cultures. The learning culture.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by that?
So I will indeed. So one of the things that I was asked to do when I was made director in the Forest Service was to create a safety culture in the Forest Service. Well, when you're asked a question like that, it's kind of good to have a good working definition of the thing you're targeting. So I started to ask everybody that I could find, how do you define safety? And the scary thing about this was I couldn't come up with a single definition of safety. Everybody had a different perception of what safety was. I'd ask leaders in the program what they felt safety was. It would be much different than field personnel, which would be much different than firefighters, which would be much different than office personnel, which is much different than the finance department, which was even really different than the health and safety department. So when I started to look at this, I had no definition, no coalescing thing that I could bring people around when I thought about safety culture. But what I did realize is that the organization, everybody in the organization understood the value of learning. So we started to think about it not in terms of what we could regulate and control, but instead what we could agree upon. And so the thing that we could agree upon were principles. Principles like do no further harm to the system or the people within the system. Principles like if it interferes with learning, deeply consider that it interferes with learning, and perhaps that'll move you not to do that action. And so instead of giving people hard and fast boundaries, we gave them principles under which they could begin to review the actions that they were about to take. And that was super helpful. Go ahead.
That is learning. If I
That's
review
learning.
before I take it, just take a second and review, that's learning.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. What a powerful lesson for, prevention of accidents, which is the original reason why I connected with you. But that's a super powerful lesson going down the line.
And it truly respects people as learners. I mean, if we spoon feed them, if we give them all the answers that we believe are true, then what have we done? We've put them in a position where they don't need to think, they don't need to learn, they just need to do. And one of the things we realized was that actually following routine in complex systems can make us more vulnerable. And we saw this in accident after accident, where people fell into a routine and that routine actually decreased their margin.
I ask you about that, yeah.
And when the margins decrease, that's when accidents happen. So we had to really start learning about where accidents occur. And what we recognized is accidents occur at an intersection of normal human and normal system variability in the presence of uncertainty. That's where accidents happen. So that goes back to exactly that, understanding and mapping those systemic conditions. If we understand that people, like, let's look at you and I, if we put ourselves, both of us, in exactly the same situation, we wouldn't fail at the same point. Right?
No, right.
And Glenn, if I could take you and I could put you in exactly the same situation more than once, you wouldn't fail at the same point. You would have learned and moved on. And so you'd fail at a different point based on your heuristics, on the things that you've learned. So when we start to think about that, we recognize that learning that takes place is natural, it's very human, and it's very important. Mm-hmm. And that, oh, by the way, when we do make a mistake, that's a great opportunity for us to learn as individuals. Mm-hmm. And if anybody's ever seen a kid learning, like falling and getting back up again, if they never fell, they'd never know how to run.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. It's all part of that process. So as we enjoin the workers in this process of learning, we have to equally enjoin leadership in the process of learning. Mm-hmm. And the way we had to do that was we had to undermine some of the assumptions that leaders had about error.
Oh, wait. Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah. Because number one assumption we have about error, it's fault. Somebody's fault.
Exactly.
Instead of it being the system at fault. Or, as you say, the environment at fault, the stage at fault, or something. Because, people don't go to work intending to hurt or kill somebody.
That's right, especially themselves usually.
Yeah, especially themselves.
We have a completely different word for that.
Yeah, I intend to live. But if you think about that, then any mistake. I used to have a leader who hammered in my head one day, people don't make mistakes on purpose. They always have the best intention. So now I can go back to her and say, yeah, they always have the best intention, but if a mistake is made, it might be inside the system that we gave for them to operate under, or the environment, or the learning, the training. Mm-hmm. It could very easily be in that.
And we have lots of empirical data to prove this, right? So we've been tracking errors and we've been tracking accidents for a really, really long time. And what we've realized is that error tracking and trying to drive error out of the system, first of all, it's futile because everybody makes mistakes. I ask, anytime I teach a class like of any size at all, I ask them, how many people have made a mistake today? And all hands go up. Everybody makes mistakes, right? Right? So if we start to think about it, that's not the focal point. Driving error out of the system would be nice if we could do it. But we have to recognize that there's a reason that people are in the system to begin with. And they're there to handle the things that the machines can't handle. They're there to do the things that machines can't do. And that's that cognition. If the airplane was just the airplane with Sully, and it was just programmed to function in a certain way, then they would not have had a successful outcome. It was his improvisation that made that situation a success. That's why people are there. So when the system delivers the unexpected, The human being has the ability to do that sense-making, learning, and improvisation. And what we find is that the larger the group in sense-making, learning, and improvisation, the easier it is for us to deal with the greater complex problems.
Okay, track that.
And that's where leadership really comes in. It's in that ability to collect information quickly in some cases, in other cases to collect information thoroughly, to try and arrive at a better solution to the problem.
Well, okay, so that actually makes kind of a smooth segue into what I'm thinking about. Academic research, that's what you're doing with real-world applications. Mm-hmm. That all applies to learning. Mm-hmm. Just explain to us the amount of academic research that you've been working on. And by the way, congratulations getting that professorship at UAB. That must be
Thank you so much.
I don't know how you're going to make that commute, but okay.
It's a long walk. Yeah, thank goodness I've got an e-bike.
Yeah, over the Rocky Mountains every day and home every night. Yeah, that'll work. So.
Fortunately, the program is a completely online program, which is good. So the research we're doing is great. So I only teach graduate students. I teach in a master's program for engineers, and one of the classes that I teach is learning-based approach to accidents and incidents. The second class that I teach is basically a critical thinking course for engineers. So where we see the best research emerging is as we start to use the mapping tool as applied to different scenarios at these different companies that are represented by our students. Almost all of our students are professionals in industry. So we get them as professionals. We're not getting undergraduate students who move into a graduate program without any work experience. Generally, almost every one of our students has a job, a full-time job. Okay. And so what they're able to do is they're able to take the mapping process that we developed, and they're able to apply it to a bunch of different scenarios. So they're constantly mapping their environment to understand that stage, how the stage is set for workers, how the stage is set for leaders. And it's also a big forgotten thing. We always think that the thing that needs to be corrected and fixed is the worker. But I got to tell you, you don't correct and fix people. That's not what you do. You correct and fix the situation that they work in. This really famous guy, James Reason, said, you cannot change the human condition. So in other words, to err or not to err is not a choice. People are going to make mistakes. But you can change the conditions under which people work. Wow, that's powerful. Yeah. But now nobody, until we came along, developed a tool that actually mapped those conditions. And so now we've got a mapping tool. It's called Network of Influences Mapping. And our students are doing this every semester, looking at their work systems and mapping their work systems. And what we're seeing is huge improvements at a local level in how the leadership relates to the worker, and how the leadership begins to understand the worker, but also how the worker can begin to understand leadership. Because you can use the same mapping tool to understand the pressures and influences that surround leaders.
Okay, so now there's two questions. First question you can answer second, but how do we get to learn from this mapping that you're doing this in the academic world? But number two, are we concerned about things not quite being right? Because you're having, even though they're working full time, they're observing it different now. I mean, that observation changes the outcome. How do you spread that out? Because if you're going to bring this into my company, I want to make sure my observations are as close to correct as possible.
So this is a really good question, actually. And it goes to this idea that there's a singular answer or a correct way of doing things. There are always better ways of doing things.
Okay.
And what we should think about in any kind of a learning culture is that we don't want perfect to be the enemy of good, first of all, because perfect is going to keep us from doing anything. Exactly. What we want to understand is that any interaction with a complex system is essentially an experiment. And some experiments fail.
Okay.
So if we're moving forward, we're going to have to take some risks. And that's in any system. And so what we do is we have validation processes that are built into the mapping function. So the validation processes are usually focus groups where we bring, again, this cognitive diversity idea. We bring people together with different viewpoints, and we ask them to look at the network of influences map, and we say this: do these influences exist in your normal work environment?
Oh.
And so that validates the data. Then we prioritize. The way we prioritize is we ask fundamentally 4 questions. 1, are the things that we've noticed that are influences outside of our control? Do they belong to the regulator, for example? Are they governed by law? So we want to know what those are. Okay?
That's a great question.
The second category is, how many of these things are long-term cultural things that we're going to have to change inside the organization? We want to know that.
Yeah. Yeah.
The third thing is, and this is the happy place, what kinds of things can we adjust or fix or address right now in terms of conditions? And usually those things are related to work schedules, pay, positions, hiring, those kinds of things. Those kinds of influences we can usually affect pretty quickly. And then the fourth category are things that we're not really sure we want to change them, because if we change them, we might have an unintended outcome that could be really bad, right? Or they're so minute that we don't want to spend any time on them, right? So those are our 4 categories.
Drivers to the problem, but those are 4 powerful, useful questions.
Yeah, and that's what we find is that once we get people thinking in this frame of influences, they're able to ask more powerful questions in different ways. But let's look at the first 2 categories, the cultural category and the regulator category.
Okay.
If we just look at those 2 categories and we say, look, there's things we can't change, we can't adjust them inside the system, they're beyond our control, they belong to the regulator, or they're huge long-term cultural things.
Okay.
Well, now what we do is we start dialogues with field personnel and with leadership. And those dialogues are designed to improve awareness about those things. So if I'm aware of the pressures that exist inside the system, I have a better way to deal with them when I'm faced with the actual work environment. And so we've literally redefined what we call situational awareness to being aware of the influences. And that helps us. That's a powerful, powerful tool for a worker. And then we couple that with another concept, and this has really driven accident rates down in the Forest Service. And the thing that we coupled it with was a construct of margin. So we've always talked about risk management. We want our workers to manage risk. Well, human beings are really good at managing risk, but they're also really, really good at normalizing risk. The longer you're exposed to a risk with no negative outcome, the more normal that risk seems to be, right? And so what we had to start thinking about was, instead of managing risk, which again was another word we couldn't get people to agree with a meaning of, we just couldn't find a unified meaning of risk. Instead, what we said was, what about if we ask them to manage margin? What if we ask them to do that?
Well, the first question would be, what do you mean by margin? Margin of profits, margin of safety, margin or all? The
beauty. For a guy who's working in the office in the finance department, margin of profit may be what he wants to manage the most. And for a leader in an organization who has to report to a board of directors, that may be a significant margin that they want to manage. But if it's a field-going person, their margin is different, but it's also something that they can manage. And we do it in a couple different ways. We do it by engineering design to begin with. So the way we design the system, we design in margin. But then the worker gets involved and starts to degrade that margin with shortcuts. All right. And that's natural, right?
Yes.
But then if we have them thinking about the network of influences that's on them, they'll understand why they're moving to those shortcuts. And then in addition, we say to them, hey, we want you to manage margin so that you have a safety bubble around you, and you will start to recognize when you're getting close to those margins. And what happens is the discussion fundamentally changes at a worker level. Instead of pulling out some checklist and going down the checklist and saying, yeah, it looks like it's going to be rainy today, or hey, our JHA, which was written in a nice air-conditioned room, says we need to look at this, and this. Yeah. Instead of that, let's think about what's going to kill us today, right? What's dumb, dangerous, and different today? And how can we manage margins around those things? And so we change it into a dialogic construct.
But that's it. That's it right there. The learning is based off of those 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because that does show the influence of everything. I mean, honestly, if we start thinking about the influence of this, we're kind of erasing the blame of somebody else.
Exactly. In fact, we've removed blame, we've removed fault, we've removed cause from our vocabulary. They don't exist anymore. The other thing that we've removed from our vocabulary is complacency. Doesn't do us any good.
Well, but see, now that's the one thing that I don't quite see in being covered here, because it's human nature to look for the shortcuts, to take it easy. I mean, how quickly do we drive the same route every day? I mean, how quickly are you going to ride the same electronic bike to work every day?
All the way to Alabama.
So we do that, but that you still can't really blame or say that accident is caused by complacency on the person's fault. What in your system, in your culture, created that complacency? Exactly. And it sounds like you're saying that complacency, and coach me here, but it sounds like you're saying that complacency is created by people being on different agendas.
Well, let's not look at it as complacency.
Okay.
Let's look at it as perspectives. So if we respect that other people in our system have different perspectives, if we respect that, then we could agentively look at those perspectives as being complacent compared to us. I mean, we're perfect, right? You and me, we're perfect.
We got this one knocked out. We wish.
So that other guy's got to be complacent. Well, the problem is when you put that label, it's a label that masquerades as an explanation. When you put that label on their activity or on their approach, what you've done is you've removed the system from removed us from understanding the system and moved us into more of a dispositional framework. So when we think about attribution, we don't think about dispositional attribution like the bad person. What we think is the situational attribution. And the situational attribution is what we want to focus on. Here's why. If we go to the dispositional place and we say that individual is complacent and, oh my goodness, they've been complacent 4 times in a row, therefore they should be fired, and we never adjust the system, we can almost guarantee that if we put somebody back into that same situation, that they're ultimately going to drift to the same failure.
Okay, that does erase this idea of saying you're complacent. It really just says the situation leads that way.
So we get rid of all dispositional language and we move into situational language. And that helps us to ask much better questions. And it helps us to really do things that create that workplace wherein workers can be successful, which is literally the way we define leadership.
Yeah, because that's what we want to do, is create a successful workplace, a safe workplace. And in order to make that happen, I mean, I'm just thinking a rough example. If I'm on the board of directors, I need profit. So therefore, the message goes to my team: get profit or we fail. It goes down the next line. Okay, well, it doesn't matter how I get profit because I don't want to fail. So therefore, I may cut some corners.
There you go.
And the same thing holds for safety. It doesn't matter. I'll cut some corners so I can get the product out that they need, or the manufacturer done they need. There's the accident. And right now, the majority of folks are still blaming that person.
And who should we blame? We could blame the board, we could blame the person. But if we don't blame anybody and we just understand that dynamic exists, then what we do is we change the message that you're saying. Your intent is not to have somebody take a dangerous shortcut. That's not your intent. I guarantee it. Someplace when you're on a board of directors, someplace you're saying be safe. Someplace you're saying that, right? So you're not telling them to take unnecessary chances or risks. So what we have to do is we have to help them to understand the pressures that you have so that they understand your message in context.
Okay. We're missing that, aren't we?
We are. Yeah, we are. We place a goal conflict on our workers all the time. We tell them to be safe, and then we tell them to get the product done by noon today, or we're going to fail as an organization. And what they're going to do is they're going to get the product done by the end of the day, and they're going to take some chances. That's what they're going to do.
And that's when safety fails.
Because they're good workers, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And the longer they work in a system that appears to be safe, the more chances they're going to take. That's just human nature. So as a leader in an organization, you've got to see that, and you've got to look for that margin. Where is margin being eroded in our system? And is it acceptable? And don't say acceptable risk, because nobody knows what that is. Nobody has a clue what acceptable risk is.
Who could? I mean, how could you? I mean, acceptable risk for an entire organization? No, you're not going to know that.
Yeah. Launching a spaceship. What's acceptable risk? Right? I mean, for Jeff Bezos, what they did was acceptable risk. For Gail King, that wasn't acceptable risk.
Yeah, it succeeded, though. That's the only reason I think that was an acceptable race. But if it didn't succeed, that would not be an acceptable loss.
Exactly. And the only way we would have known that is an outcome. And the one thing that they didn't fully know was outcome. There was still an element of risk involved. So nothing that a human endeavors to do is risk-free. Nothing. Everything has some element of risk.
And we're all trying to decide what's acceptable for this one company. And because we have different goals, I'm going to choose something else that's acceptable that you didn't choose.
Exactly. You got it. And that's the conundrum for our workers. And that's the battlefield, if you will, let's go back to the stage metaphor. It's much better. That's the stage that leaders need to understand that they're setting for their workers. Right? And if I can understand that stage, maybe I can do different choreography. But the only way for me to engage in understanding that stage is to ask questions and be in a mode of humble inquiry.
Tweetable phrase, humble inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
That's tweetable. I'm going to tweet it. I'm going to make sure that gets out there. But also another tweetable phrase was psychological confidence.
Yes.
Those were tweetable phrases. I want to be really respectful for your time because you've been loading us with some great information. I've learned so much. I think this is one of those, if not the most I've learned in a podcast, this is definitely in the top 2. I mean, it's wonderful learning. With that said, though, what did I miss that I should have been asking you about, we should have been talking about? What did I miss?
Actually, I think we were really thorough. If I had days to talk with you, I'd enjoy doing it because I really enjoyed this interaction. It was fantastic. These are learnings that we've had, that we've developed in our organization. My wife has a company called Dynamic Inquiry, and these are learnings that we've developed in Dynamic Inquiry for years. We've literally been working on this concept for over 24 years. Now what we're starting to see greater interest. And I guess what I would say is, if your listeners have a question about this, don't hesitate to contact me. Reach out and contact me. You're welcome to take our program has courses that you can take without being in the degree program, so you can just take our courses. If you want to hear more about this and spend some time with it, we can make that happen.
Okay. Look in the description. Look in the show notes, ladies and gentlemen. That information is there. Okay. You're teaching at the UAB now. Do you have time? If someone said, hey, Dr. Ivan, come talk to my leadership team. Do you do that type of work?
We just finished doing our first. So COVID put us in a very different place. We used to do these only in person for some very specific reasons. But COVID put us into a position where we had to do some online work. And we just finished our first online learning review course for 2 companies in England. And so we have developed a way of doing that is workable and is fun, which is a big part of learning. I think that you have to have fun when you're learning. If you ain't smiling, you ain't learning.
And that's the killer with COVID. You don't really get the Zoom. You don't really get to connect with people.
That's it. That's the problem.
But, we're kind of working our way out of it. I hope so. But
I think so. Getting
to travel again and do those type of things, that's useful. So, but people can contact you from the information in the show description to say, hey, come see. You have books out too. You written a couple books?
I have papers and a TED Talk, but we're working on our book right now. We had it in draft form a couple of different times and just never pulled the trigger on printing it. But my wife's specialty is the language of investigation, and we're doing a book together right now. So
excellent. So that's good. So I'm gonna play my leadership skills on you. Say, when are you going to have that book out?
Let's see. By the end of this year.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll be done by the end of this year.
Invite you back. I'm going to almost not invite. I'm going to just beg you to come back and talk about that book and maybe we got to do it with your wife too, since she's co-writing it. So
I think we should
divide the screen into thirds, and we all can just jump on and go. So that'd be
fun. Plus, she's a lot better looking than I am, so that already is a bonus.
You know what though? She probably is. But it seems like you're a person who plays up your game a little bit, get out of the ballpark and run for the best. So she probably is. But I tell you, I really have enjoyed this. It's just been really powerful. It's one of those I'm going to go back through and dissect a couple of times. I would suggest all our leaders do the same thing, because this might be the key you're looking for to run a safe organization. But it ran really deeper than that. Not just a safe organization. You got a more productive organization when you understand the stage.
Exactly.
So yeah, absolutely perfect. Thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you for connecting with us here at Touchstone Publishers. Please join our group Essential Leadership Skills and share your leadership knowledge with us all.